For this sample, we are going to do a French seam. Now this is a more couture finish, and it's something you would only do on a garment which had relatively straight seams. It doesn't really work on curves. So we've got our two long pieces, and the first thing we're going to do is mark where our 1 centimetre seam should start and finish. Now I'm just going to mark that on one piece of fabric. And you'll see why I've marked that in a moment. Now the first step, and this is where my seam is going to be, along this edge, that's why I've marked it there. But it's going to be a little bit different. We're actually going to stitch this with the wrong sides facing. Normally we stitch with the right sides facing. So here we've got the wrong sides and the right sides on the outside, and it will make sense once I've finished. Now I've got my machine set to straight stitch, and I'm going to do a very narrow seam to begin with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my raw edge with just the inside edge here to the right of the middle of my presser foot. So it's kind of where that gap there finishes. That's where I'm lining up my raw edge. So making sure your edges are lined up, I'm going to pinch it at one end and hold it nice and taut and flat, and stitch a very narrow seam. Now what a French seam is, it's a seam where the raw edge is completely encased. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to the ironing board. So I'm at the ironing board. Now I've got my iron set to cotton, and I've got my steam switched on as well. You have to make sure you've got water in the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my two pieces, finger press one side over nice and flat, and give that an iron. So it needs to be ironed really nice and flat and open, and then that with the right side facing up, I'm going to fold it again and iron it so that fold is right on that seam line. So you can see that my seam line is just right on the fold. So I'm back at my machine, and I've got my wrong side facing out now. I've got that little tiny seam that I stitched before, ironed so it sits right on the fold, and I'm going to stitch from this end to that end where I marked it. So when you're doing that, I'm going to line up that middle edge with my mark, and if I'm looking at this, it's kind of just shy of the edge of the presser foot, so I'm going to keep it in that position. Little reverse, pinching it together and keeping it nice and flat, stitch, keeping it lined up with that spot on the foot, which is just shy of the edge of the presser foot. And then finish at your other mark with a little reverse stitch. So that is my seam. Now if I open that up, that's the outer fabric and that's the inner fabric. So you can see that that seam is completely enclosed. So there isn't a raw edge at all.